Welcome to Navigating Minds, and thank you for joining us on our short form content. Today we will be discussing the difference between anxiousness and an anxiety disorder, a common misconception that we hope to clear up for you by the end of the video. We're joined today by the CEO of Anxend, Maurice Edelson, who will be providing his knowledge on the topic. Maurice, first off, thank you for joining us.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
I'd love to start this off by discussing what the difference actually is between anxiousness and anxiety disorders. Could you tell us a bit more about that?
So I think when it comes to anxiety, the first misconception is we all are anxious at certain times in our life. There's nothing wrong with being anxious. And it's there for a good reason, and it's there to keep us safe and to protect us from threats and danger. The problem is when it becomes more than that, and it becomes debilitating, and it stops you from doing things that are considered normal in life. So when we look at young people, stopping them going to school, stopping them getting out the house, doing extramural activities, anything that avoids them doing what you would consider normal is when we start seeing it turn into an anxiety disorder. Clinically, an anxiety disorder is when it's been prevalent for a few months, generally up to 6 months. And they've scored particularly high scores on a GAD-7 test regularly for a 6-month period. Bottom line, from a parent's perspective, I think if you feel it's becoming stopping your child doing things, you need to start taking note.
Love that. If it's so common, I know you say that everyone feels that way. Why do you think it's so heavily dismissed in sort of day-to-day life?
I think the reason it's heavily dismissed is because it's so common and because we all are anxious at certain times in our life. There's nothing wrong with being anxious. We are accustomed to it. We deal with it. And if somebody doesn't have a disorder, you almost fob it off because it's done its job. It's protected you or saved you from a specific situation or a threat, and you move on. Where people can't move on, that's the problem. Where they get stuck and they get trapped in this feeling of being totally overwhelmed by the anxiety and stops them living life. For somebody who isn't in that space, I don't think you can ever really put yourself in that position of knowing what it feels like to be that stuck.
Yeah. Do you think there's any, we see this all the time. Do you think there are many like sort of common misconceptions about anxiety and anxiety disorders? Because I feel like it's something that's always brushed under the rug massively. So I just wanted to see on your view, have you found any misconceptions from people so far?
Absolutely. I mean, we obviously deal with young people, so sort of 25 and under generally. And I think often we find parents, teachers will put it down to hormones, age, a child's blowing things out of proportion and it's not really going to be a problem. And for a parent, very often we will turn around and say, you know what, just give it a go. It's not going to be as bad as you think. And yet for that young person, it's worse. It is as bad as they think it's going to be because for them it's real. I think the big misconception is that anxiety, like many other mental health struggles, is in your head and you're imagining it. And I think for people who don't have that struggle, you think you can flick a switch and turn it off. It's not that simple. It's overwhelming, totally consuming for the person who's going through those struggles. The other big misconception is that you're imagining the symptoms. The symptoms are real. They're physically real. They are. RBS is real. The nausea is real. The sweaty palms are real. The racing hearts are real. Those aren't things that you're imagining. You're actually experiencing them, and they're physically happening to you. I think the scary part is very often with young people, they get taken to a doctor or a clinician of sorts, be it a psychiatrist, therapist, you name it, and they go for a specific symptom. Take RBS as an example, and they'll go and see a GP, and the GP will say, well, there's nothing wrong with you. If this young person is struggling, they genuinely have a problem.
Yeah.
And yet nobody can find the cause or why they have the problem that they're dealing with. So I think very often parents brush it under the carpet as something that children are just raising because they are finding life difficult. And often we'll talk to parents and teachers and the answer will be, but life is difficult. They've just got to deal with it, suck it up and deal with it. It's not that simple.
How do you then go about addressing those misconceptions then? If is it education? Is it?
Absolutely, it's education. And I think one of the biggest misconceptions, and something that I find very interesting how society deals with most mental health problems when it comes to young people. I often will tell parents who come to us a bit of a story where if your child is sick and you go to the GP and let's say they have a tummy bug, the GP will give the parents the remedy. They'll tell the parents how to look after their child. Yet somehow when it comes to mental health struggles and disorders, they go and see a psychiatrist or psychologist on their own if they're over 12. They have a discussion with this clinician, and then they might see them again in 10 days or 2 weeks' time. And in between, this young person is supposed to administer their own remedy. It's crazy because a young person cannot significantly change their environment. They don't have any say on the home they live in, the food that's put on the table, the school they go to. They cannot make those changes on their own. Yet somehow, mental health, they've got to fix it themselves.
Sorry to interrupt, Maurice. Just wanted to cut across you there. Is that a safeguarding thing they do that for?
Well, no, I don't think it is a safeguarding thing because certainly in the UK, there are certain children have got choices from the age of 12. If they wanted to be on their own, they can.
Right. Okay.
And I get that. I understand that. But very often a young person's not given that choice. If they're going through the NHS, they are given a counsellor, and that counsellor is a one-on-one session just for them. Very, very seldom that a solution includes the whole family, which I think is where the biggest problem lies, is that helping a young person recover from a mental health struggle requires the whole family. We often at Anxend, we say that it takes a village to raise a child. You need a community around you. You need people around you. You need everybody to understand your struggles so that you're in a space that can accommodate you and understand you and deal with your struggles when you're feeling overwhelmed.
Love that.
Completely agree. For the people listening at home, is there any advice you give on being able to spot the difference between symptoms of anxiousness and anxiety disorders, just being at home and not seeing a specialist?
So I think I'm going to rewind just a little bit and explain the differences between being anxious and having an anxiety disorder, specifically focusing on young people, because a lot of parents, I'd say 9 times out of 10, the parents I speak to don't know the difference. And I normally use a little story to explain it. So if you imagine you crossing a road and out of the blue, out of nowhere, a car comes racing towards you and you're stuck in the middle of the street, you know this car is going to hit you. In that moment, our body kicks in to our FFFR response. So it produces adrenaline and cortisol. And the first function of those two hormones are to risk assess the situation and come up with a solution. Now, it does its job. It gets us off the road, and we're now sitting on the side of the road. And if you as a parent, I want you to think in that moment, you're going through an incredible amount of sensations are running through your body. You'll have sweaty palms, racing heart. You might even want to vomit from the nausea in the pit of your stomach from this near miss. Those are real. They're proper sensations. They're physical. But as a parent or as an adult, you get up, you dust yourself off, and you still got to get to the other side of the road.
Yeah.
And what we do is we use logic, and we turn around and we say to ourselves, you know what? Freak accident, the chance of that happening again, highly unlikely. I'm going to look left, I'm going to look right, probably 20 times, but I will still get myself to the other side of the road. Makes sense? The difference with our young people is that the part of the brain that makes that logical decision, the prefrontal cortex, is only fully developed at about the age of 25.
Wow.
So when we look at our young people, children, teenagers, young university students, all the decisions that they're making are not based on logic, they're based on emotion. So when we talk about young people blowing things up and making a mountain out of a molehill, it's because it's an emotional decision. It is a big decision for them. It is personal, it's intense, and it's very, very serious. So for them, they can't just brush it under the carpet and say, you know what, logic says I'll be okay. And that's a big difference between a parent and looking at the young person, be it a child or a university student. There's a difference in thinking, number one. Number two, when it goes from being anxious to an anxiety disorder, our adrenal glands, just like the rest of our body, and Joe, I know you're into fitness, or we all are, but if we go to gym and we lift weights, the more we lift the weights, our muscles get bigger. If I'm a free diver and I dive every day and I hold my breath, my lung capacity expands. The same thing happens with our adrenal glands. If we're constantly worried, constantly trying to figure out a problem in our head, our adrenal glands also adapt and change. So if we take a very simple example, let's assume a child doesn't want to go to school. And that might be because there's a teacher that they don't like, or they're being bullied, whatever the reason might be. They lie in bed at night and they worry about going to school the next day. They wake up in the morning, it's the first thing on their mind. They get to school, they sit in class waiting for something to happen. And this goes on day in and day out. And eventually what the adrenal gland does, and every child and every person is different. It could be a matter of days, weeks, months, or years. Everybody's different. But what happens is the adrenal gland turns the dial up just one notch, just gives a little bit of extra adrenaline, because what the brain's saying is, I've got a problem. I need to resolve this problem. But in reality, there isn't a problem. There's no physical threat and there's no real problem. So now you've got a little bit of adrenaline and you're trying to resolve a problem that physically is non-existent. So over time, that dial gets turned up and up and up and up. And what eventually happens is, I often equate it to a pot of chilled milk. The normal way that it works is, if we look at the milk being the adrenaline, and you and I, we put it on the stove, and when it's simmering, that's the milk, that's the adrenaline doing its job through our body. Now, what happens with our young people, over time, they become the constantly simmering pot of milk. For you and I, that's the maximum. That's when the adrenal glands are doing its job. Our young people learn to live with that. They cope with that situation. They deal with it on a daily basis. They control themselves at school. They retain it and hold it in. It's really, really difficult. But because it's gone gradually, they don't know any different. So the RBS, the nausea, the sweaty palms, those are just parts of life.
Yep.
But the adrenal gland still works. So when something happens and sends them just a little bit beyond that, the adrenal gland gives them another burst of adrenaline. And instead of going from the chilled pot to the simmering pot of milk, they go from the simmering pot of milk to the pot boiling over. And that's when we see the lashing out, the tantrums, the hiding in the bedroom, you name it. And we see all sorts of different reactions and behaviors coming out. That's when it becomes a disorder. The problem from a parent's perspective is, and teachers, we tend to address the behavior. So we want to address why they're lashing out, why they're hiding in their bedroom. We don't go back and sort of say, well, why are the adrenaline levels so high? What's spiking these adrenaline levels? How do we turn the dial back down? And we also forget that it's probably taken 6 months, 12 months to get to this point. And you think you can flick a switch and just turn it off. It's going to take you 6 months to get it back down to what's considered normal.
That's so interesting.
So, I don't know, that explains the difference.
Yeah. I just want to touch on, you touched there about parents or teachers. What would your advice be for those listening to this who is a parent or a teacher, to those who feel like their children are suffering from an anxiety disorder? You touched it a little bit then, but the advice moving forward, if they're worried that a student or one of their kids have a disorder of some description.
So my advice to parents always is, you know your children best. So you know if your child's behaving in a way that's not within their demeanor, their personalities. You also know when your child's not comfortable. I think the first thing parents and teachers need to ask is, could this be something else? Could they be so overwhelmed that they can't be themselves? And put yourself in that position when you are really anxious about something, and think what that makes you feel like, where you are short and sharp and you lash out at people. And our children have the less ability to deal with that. So I think as a parent, you've got to question and you've got to ask, and you've got to make sure that you don't manage the behavior. Try and understand the cause of the behavior. Try and go back and see what the root cause is. I mean, this discussion's about anxiety. At Anxend, we deal with all mental health issues. And the reason we focus on anxiety is because most mental health issues start with anxiety. Left unchecked, it develops into other things.
Maurice, that's amazing. That's one of the best 15-minute audio bites I think we've ever done. So thank you so much. That's packed full of information. For those of you listening at home, we hope you enjoyed this episode of our short form content. If you want to learn more about Anxend and the amazing work they do, the links are down below in the description, where you will also find a free anxiety test to take if you wish. But for the meantime, thank you for joining the three of us today. I'm Tom.
I'm Joe.
And this is Navigating Life.
Thanks very much.
Thanks, guys.